about the value of a centralized directory service put on by the Michigan Health Information Network. If you have questions during the presentation today, please submit them during using the chat. Excuse me, please submit them using the chat. We'll have some question and answer time at the end where we'll be going through the chat questions, as well as you'll be able to unmute yourself and ask at that time. If we don't have time to get through all the questions, please submit them to the chat or email them to us, and we'll make sure we'll follow up to every question, even if we don't have time for them. So you've all joined here today to learn about MyHIN's Health Directory and how it can help you. When we talk about a directory, it's usually not that exciting for people. You have a really basic model here. You have a bunch of stuff that you want to capture, you store that stuff in a directory, and it can be referenced by other places and things, and it can be output different ways. But really, a directory isn't the goal for most people. A directory is just a means to an end, and it's not that exciting. So you're probably saying to yourself, that's great, I already know a little bit about the health directory, but what's the big deal? Why are provider directories so hard? What is the big deal, and what is the health directory doing to help solve those? So the big deal is that, first of all, there are a bunch of different sources that have information about providers in our ecosystem. And they all have bits and pieces about that provider that need to be reconciled in order to get a complete picture. There's no single source out there that's going to have a comprehensive view on who a provider is. Even if you get to the point where you have, if you're talking to the provider themselves, they're pretty authoritative about most of their information. You know, if they can say, this is definitely my name, this is definitely my hours that I'm available, this is definitely where I practice. There's a lot of information, and they may know things outside of that, but they may not be authoritative about it. For example, the licenses that provider holds, if you take the provider's word for it, then you may be accepting a lot of bad information, and you're also introducing risk into that. So you need to take the licensing boards, and in Michigan, that's licensing and regulatory affairs, into account. And then you also have to take into account a bunch of different other people and places and stakeholders who have perspectives and different levels of authority of different kinds of data like that. There are different perspectives on data. So one of the key places we see this surface is in organizations. What I define as an organization may not be what somebody else defines as an organization. And this is most commonly a shift when we're talking about payers. If I go on the street and go to a practice, I may see two different practices side by side, or I may see one door with one name on the door, but the two practices I mentioned may use the same billing information, and the insurance company may see it as one organization. Or maybe even though there's only one door, they have a bunch of different billing codes that they use because each doctor is independently practicing, and the insurance company sees that as 5 different practices. And being able to consolidate that and figure out who's talking about the same place takes a lot of intentionality. There are requirements by a lot of different places to have quarterly attestations by providers. We know that the largest of those are obviously in our ecosystem, CAQH, but there's still a lot of payers using other systems and a lot of people who need provider information using other systems. The final big deal, part of the problem with tracking provider information in a directory in our space, is that when someone wants to have information to notify a provider, that is a very broad statement. It can mean a lot of different things. It can mean sending something to the provider directory directly that they're going to read. It can be contacting their office. It can be sending a message that's going to be ingested into their electronic health record, and when they're seeing that patient, they're going to see some information there about that patient. But the provider may not have actually been notified about anything in that case. And when you have a directory and the intent is to be able to use that information to notify a provider, it gets complicated fast. Hopefully that explains a little bit of some of the difficulty here and the rub. Here's the agenda we're going to be going through. I'm going to be talking about what the health directory is, why it matters. Then we're going to talk about what's changed in the health directory recently. That's where some of you are probably going to be most interested. I'm going to talk a little bit about how direct addresses is a really big need in our ecosystem for a really simple use case, and the health directory can help address this problem. We're going to talk about some of the 21st Century Cures Act requirements and compliance with a FHIR-based provider directory. And then finally, we're going to dig a little deeper into what MyHIN's cooking up and how the health directory interacts with social determinants of health-related information. So the health directory really boils down into two different big things. On the left, you can see there's traditional provider directory elements. That's things like who a provider is, where they practice, what's their email, what's their phone number, what's their specialties. That's information that's core to what the provider directory is outside of health information exchange. And what we've really done is married that concept with what a health information exchange needs in order to route information, such as endpoints, knowing where you want to get information sent. So health information can be sent using the health directory kind of as a router. And we're going to take a look at that on the next slide. Another powerful thing about the health directory is its ability to dynamically capture relationships. That falls onto the left side of traditional provider directories. But the way a lot of traditional provider directories have addressed the problem of where a provider practices is by making it an attribute on the provider instead of storing a discrete record of that organization. So Dr. John Smith can practice at Good Health at 123 Any Street, and some other Dr. Michael Taylor can practice at Good Health LLC at 123 Any Street Suite A, and they may or may not be practicing at the same place. The provider directory doesn't have to care. They're storing that as an attribute on the provider, not trying to reconcile who the players are in our ecosystem. Our general approach, going back to that first model that I had shown, is still having different data coming in, storing it, and different data going out. But we're trying to take some unique approaches to some of this. Number one is our use and adoption and promotion of FHIR. When I get to the what's new, I'll go a little bit deeper, but we've completely refreshed our FHIR API to be compliant with a lot of the different needs that people have to talk about provider data interoperably. We take in data from national sources, from different batch processes, files that some of the stakeholders on this call may be familiar with, such as ACRES files. We're taking those into the health directory. And then we also have a portal where data can be contributed. One of the key changes that's happening right now is this idea of intelligent matching. From the beginning, we've really centralized around the idea of an identifier needing to exist for organizations. And that's been a problem in our ecosystem. And intelligent matching is intended to help us try to address that as we're continuing to roll out to additional sectors of the market, like when we get to social determinants of health. That's also something we're going to dive deeper into, but I want to highlight the fact that that's something that's added to this model more recently. Something very intentionally done in our model when we're storing information is that we're not just storing provider information. I'm going to reiterate this throughout the presentation because I want it to be well understood. We're able to capture the traditional providers captured in a provider directory, but we're also including into our picture of who is involved and who the players are in the system. We're bringing in care coordinators. we are tracking the organizations that I mentioned, like practices, like physician organizations, accountable care organizations, clinically integrated networks, and other organization types, as well as community resources. And the value there is that because we're using the health directory for this health information exchange type situation, we can identify who all the players are so that data can go to all the right people, and maybe we can have some more interaction in our space between those parties as well. Then we're able to export the data, both again using the HL7 Fire API. Then we have standard reports to get the data out. We're working on a rostering scenario where you give a list of providers that you care about, and we will return what we think is the most accurate information for them. And then also through the portal, you're able to search for that information. So here's an intelligent routing example that dates back to MyHin's core, probably back in 2012, maybe 2013. But the idea is that a patient goes to a hospital, a notification is generated and ultimately sent to MyHin. At this point, MyHin has to figure out what to do with this message. So we first look at who the patient is in the message and say, who is the patient? Once we identify the patient, we say, who cares about this patient? And that is the Active Care Relationship Service. The Active Care Relationship Service will return a list of providers who have a relationship with this patient. Then we look up in the health directory, where do we want to deliver information for this particular doctor and this particular care coordinator and this nurse? And then we deliver the information to the appropriate location. So that's one way the health directory is used in the health information exchange space. Now let's dive a little bit into identifiers in our space. MyHin has really gone through a journey, and the state of Michigan as a whole, in rolling out identifiers. We first looked at what identifiers already existed in the ecosystem. We saw the national provider identifier. We saw tax identification numbers being used. And those are both being used in the billing context. So as we were trying to identify things down to a site level, the NPI and the TIN really it struck out in what we were trying to accomplish, because there may be, in this picture, you could see within the four walls of one side, there's two different offices that are submitting billing using a shared identifier, like a shared NPI, and the third one isn't sharing with the other two. But it is sharing an identifier with some organization at a totally different site. And so the NPI and the TID are not reconcilable down to a site level. So what we did at the time was we followed suit with the state of Michigan with their public health reporting needs, and followed suit with what HL7 and meaningful use was all pushing at the time, the use of object identifiers. And if you didn't know, OID stands for object identifier, not organization identifier, but we definitely use it to identify organizations. In partnership with the state of Michigan, everyone was encouraged, if they were participating in our use cases, required to register an OID, or MyHin would help you get one registered for every site that was participating in Health Information Exchange. That actually worked really well. It worked well because we had a really strong incentive, and that gave people a lot of motivation to participate. But as we're continuing to expand outside of the realm of where we've already had success, especially in the social determinants of health space, trying to continue that methodology with organizations that don't have a strong carrot or stick yet to register OIDs themselves is going to be a difficult proposition. Oh, I didn't realize that was the end of that slide, sorry. that's going to be a difficult proposition. And so that's where we're starting to introduce the idea of intelligent organization matching. And the idea there is similar to our common key service. We're going to be looking at all the attributes about an organization that we can get. We're going to be comparing those attributes using probably some similar techniques to what the common key service is using to identify exactly whom we're talking about, using address, using phone numbers and email addresses and things like that to try to reconcile who we're talking about. Yeah. So here's an example of real world complexity. All the names have been changed in the scenario, but this was a real doctor that we had found, and we went to one particular website that identified this provider as practicing in 10 different practices, which already seems like a crazy workload. And then we went to another website with information about this provider, and they listed 3 practices, but one of those 3 wasn't even one of the 10 we found on the other site. Then when you start bringing in the state of Michigan's perspective, when you start thinking about how the information is communicated up to the Health Information Exchange, it starts to get even cloudier than that. So these particular patient-centered medical homes that I'm listing here were regional. And so because they're regional, each practice rolled up to a discrete patient-centered medical home. And if you asked any one of these organizations, any of the practices, any of the PCMHs, if you asked the state, or if you went to NPES or the medical board, any of those parties, they would have had a very different perspective on what this provider does and where they practice. So let's take a look at some of the use cases and products that use or will use the health directory. Some of these are current state, some of these are future looking. The admission, discharge, and transfer notifications, or ADTs, the medication reconciliation, or MedRec, and laboratory results, or labs, are all current state. The interop station is one of our solutions that can do a lot of things, but one of the early things it's focused on doing is helping people meet 21st Century Cures Act requirements. And the health directory is the core provider directory solution as part of interop station. We are working on a telehealth registry where there's a registry of what telehealth services any given provider uses, possibly some information about when they use them, and some other related information about that telehealth that can be used as a reference point for other services. Our Referrals Plus tool is going to be using the health directory for the organizations that are participating in referrals specifically. It won't be looking up organizations outside of that small network, but within that network, it will be requiring its participants to maintain up-to-date information about their hours of operation, about their accurate information necessary to make a referral. So that way, when the Referrals Plus tool goes looking for someone to make a referral to, you'll have that information available, but we are incorporating that into our health directory, so that information isn't just a one-time use piece of information. It can be reused and repurposed again. Coordinating the care coordinators is a large effort that's been going on for the past 2 or 3 years, and that was the idea that we've been tracking medical providers, and we required an NPI in order to get into our ecosystem, but care coordinators are often left out of that mix, but they might be the ones who actually care about provider notifications sometimes. And so bringing care coordinators into the health directory's purview is now part of the health directory scope. You can register care coordinators to be in the health directory, and then subsequently they'll be able to participate in message routing and receive messages for the patients that they are coordinating care for. Our e-consent service is going to have a tool that allows you to populate it with providers and organizations that a patient gives consent to share their information, and the list of providers and organizations used for e-consent is going to be driven by the health directory. So as you're going to see, there's an organizational strategy here to start pointing more and more at the health directory to drive efficiencies. As we improve the data in the health directory, other scenarios will benefit as well. Finally, we're getting to the social determinants of health space. We're expanding the scope from just those that provide care in the medical world, in the healthcare space, and also starting to include social determinants of health or community-based organizations, so that they're going to be able to participate in information like the referrals use case, or maybe there's a community information exchange that begins to evolve that can also reference our health directory. And our direct secure messaging product called Diretto is also going to have a lookup for direct addresses built into it to look up addresses from the health directory. So what's really new? Some of you who are familiar with the health directory and what we had been doing in the past, this is where you're probably going to want to take the most notes. So the intelligent organization matching is one of the big movements that we're working on right now. The idea that we could take in data for organizations that do not have an identifier, but still be able to uniquely identify them. We are migrating the health directory whole package, the back end, the front end, everything, to Amazon Web Services. We are doing that because it is more secure than the way that the health directory is implemented now. It definitely increases speed from the current platform. It is more cost effective for us, and it's aligned with our overall strategic move to clouds and move to the cloud, I should say, and aligning with our other Amazon Web Services infrastructure. In part of the migration to the Amazon Web Services platform, the last bullet comes into play that we've really tried to stay aligned with the FHIR model all along the way, but with this implementation, we started from the ground up and said, we want to start with the provider directory elements from FHIR and be aligned with that completely, and then only add and extend the model to what we have to capture beyond that. And that's a little bit different of an approach than we took before. And as a result, our FHIR API should be much more reliable than it's ever been. The FHIR API should be much more comprehensive than it's ever been as well. That covers all of the primary resources identified in the Validated Healthcare Directory, or VHDIR, specifications for the HL7 FHIR spec. We did also, as part of moving to the Amazon Web Services, completely redesign the user interface, the portal. I'll give you a little view into that in just a minute. I already mentioned, we revamped the FHIR API and we're compliant with the VHDIR specifications. We have just now introduced the idea of the telehealth registry or teleregistry. The idea that we can capture information about who your telehealth vendor is, what times it's available, and we can capture, it's not my particular area of expertise as to what level of data we're going to be getting or requiring, but it can capture at the provider level what days and or even times a telehealth tool may be used. And finally, that telehealth, or sorry, finally, that social determinants of health space, incorporating community-based organizations. And as part of that expansion, we're able to capture things like services, and we're using the human services data specification to complement the FHIR model there. And that is starting to be looked at, especially by things like the Gravity Project on their taxonomies and their codes that they're using. They've been looking at the AIRS taxonomy that the Human Services Data Specification uses. And so we're getting a little bit ahead of the curve on FHIR there. The services that an organization can provide is important to how a community resource directory can work, because you're going to be looking not for an organization type, but for specific services. An example of that could be a homeless shelter doesn't just fall under the homeless shelter category, but there's a code for they offer beds. There's a code for they offer showers. There's a code for they have a meal program where they serve breakfast, or I don't know. There's codes for all those different services that can be offered by an organization at a site. Let's talk about direct addresses for a bit. The idea of a direct address directory is a no-brainer. Everybody wants one that's reliable. The direct trust directory, the direct trust governing body has a direct trust directory that is the most reliable thing we have to date. There are some problems with that, though. The problem with the direct trust directory is that we can only share information from that directory with those who use our HISP, our Diretto product. So when we have stakeholders that want to look up a direct address for any number of reasons, but they are doing so from a non-Diretto HISP perspective, for example, I want to make a referral. I'm using the referral application. I want to look up this direct address and send a message to the provider. I cannot disclose that to you unless you are using Diretto legally. So what we are hoping to do with the health directory is to capture direct addresses that are known in our ecosystem, in our space, wherever the health directory is deployed, so that it can be a reusable shared service of direct addresses that can be used. And I guess I should mention, related to this diagram, that we're able to capture endpoints on a provider, on an organization, or on a relationship between a provider and an organization. So if you want to say, this is the direct address for this provider when they're at this specific practice, we're able to capture endpoints at that level, and direct addresses are stored as endpoints. Now let's get into how we might be able to help some stakeholders meet compliance requirements. The 21st Century Cures Act set a new precedent for certain stakeholders, most namely payers, to have a FHIR compliant provider directory solution that can be used and referenced using the FHIR standards. That particular law pointed to a CMS final rule. The CMS final rule, this is kind of a fun nested train of thought here. So the CMS final rule then pointed to the HL7 FHIR DaVinci PDEX PlanNet implementation guide. And when you go to the PDEX implementation guide, that's the second screenshot down here. You can see they're not defining the concept themselves. They are based on the Validated Healthcare Directory implementation guide. So through a series of direct pointers, we arrive at the actual specification that's required for this provider directory, the Validated Healthcare Directory implementation guide, which is what we've rebaselined our health directory to be modeled through. The health directory itself does not meet this requirement for anyone. You would have to adopt it, and also if you are using this as if you want to publicly expose a Fire API provider directory and don't have one of your own, that's where interop station really comes into play. Our health directory is just going to be able to serve up the data to known entities using Fire, and it will align the data in the right way. It'll serve it up in the validated healthcare directory specification. Then you'll need some sort of public-facing interface at that point from there. Diving back to health directory scope, and now we're going to take a look at social determinants of health again. Traditionally, the health directory, well, I should say traditional provider directories focus on licensed medical practitioners. That served provider directory needs very well, because when we were having a directory just be consumer facing, we wanted them to find the people they wanted to set an appointment up with. And so a provider directory would list all the providers that they could schedule an appointment with, and the times that they're, like the days of week that their office is open, things like that. But the health directory expands its scope greatly. We've recently been working on the care coordinators project, like I mentioned, to include them into our space, even though they don't typically fall in that licensed medical practitioner role. But what we're doing now is saying, well, there's this whole other side of what influences a patient's health that needs to become part of our overall view of health information exchange. It needs to become part of the approaches that we're taking to solve problems. That can include solving food needs, solving housing needs, solving all sorts of different problems outside of what a provider proper's purview is. There are times where we'll want to have them involved for referrals. There are times where we'll need to have them involved for all different types of scenarios. But the key takeaway here is that there is much more influence on a patient's health from outside of the healthcare space than from inside the healthcare space. And there are times where a patient's care could be greatly improved and outcomes greatly improved if we have these other points for community-based organizations to be involved in their care. The expansion of the model to include those organizations adds a number of things to the model. And so you can see the two main columns on the right there was what I showed earlier in that picture. And that's the basic construct of the provider directory. Obviously, there's a lot more to it than that, but basically we were tracking providers, organizations, the providers network, and endpoints associated with them. And adding the social determinants of health and community-based organization data, it's a pretty substantial model expansion. So we're going to be tracking service areas, the service that's provided at a location, languages and accessibility information. All of those types of details are being added into the model to serve this purpose. And I think with that, we've gone through all the agenda topics a little ahead of schedule, actually, which is good. And so that means that we've got time for questions. At this time, we will take a look at the chat and see what questions were submitted. But if you have a question, you may unmute and ask now.
I have a question about the ability to clean up some of the OID affiliations. For example, we have an organization that leans heavily on locum tenens and Doctors Direct, where we often have that situation you described earlier, where a doctor's located at 10 different places and they're not all matched up. What's the pathway to reconcile that information?
Excellent question. So there's a couple different approaches that's in the short term, but they're not going to completely solve the problem in the short term. But in the short term, part of the intent behind the active care relationship service delivery files is to not, well, let me go a little bit larger. The active care relationship service in general is trying to capture who has a relationship with this patient and where do they have this relationship with the patient. And so when we get the active care relationship service delivery file, we should be getting the information about the provider and their relationships with different organizations. We are still depending on the participants in our network to be reporting on that information. And as we increase adoption of additional providers, or maybe a provider was participating at some practices, but not all of them, that picture should become more complete. That said, that is not a holistic solution to the problem, but it is definitely one of the avenues towards solving the problem. Is we are getting reports of those relationships as they apply to patients instead of just how they apply to billing. The next part in that equation starts coming down to this idea that that CAQH put forth. I don't even remember how long ago now. I want to say it was 2017, but don't quote me on that. They formed a group, maybe it was even 2016. They formed a group called the, shoot, I can't remember. It had the word collaborative in it, I think. I've said it so many times I can't remember. But they wrote a white paper basically indicating that there needs to be more free exchange of provider information, and MyHIN is completely supportive of that effort. Action Alliance. It was Provider Directory Action Alliance. That was the name of the group. And the idea that if MyHIN gets information about where a provider practices, we want to be able to share that with those that need it, like a CAQH. And similarly, CAQH getting data can enrich the whole community as well. There still needs to be a proper revenue stream, so we're not hurting CAQH and CAQH isn't hurting us. But I think that everybody who's collecting the data understands the weight and burden that they are putting on the provider community when they have to give their information multiple times. And everybody is trying to consolidate that. I think it's a matter of time figuring out what the right solution is. The Provider Directory Action Alliance laid out an infrastructure for doing that, and MyHIN still supports that and would, if action were happening nationally, we would jump in on that.
Well, to follow up to that question, sorry, this is Donovan again. One of our workarounds has been to route DMAs and other such registries to a centralized person that represents each clinic, such as a care coordinator or something. I understand that we're making movement away from that process, which is excellent. I fully agree with that. But for the organizations that have those workflows in place currently, is there a crosswalk plan or some way that we can share that information with you?
Well, first of all, some way that you can share with us, absolutely. We can bring in that information through any number of ways. It could be a batch file, XML or CSV. We could utilize the Fire API. I would love to utilize the Fire API, but I'm not going to assume that any organization is ready for that yet. But definitely, we would love to get that information so that we don't have to ask for it again.
Great, thank you very much.
other questions? You know, I thought that I had a shot in this presentation of the new user interface and I had plugged it. I realize now that wasn't in this deck. And since we have time, I'm going to go find the picture real quick.
May I ask a quick question?
Of course.
This is Kay Gillette from Ascension. So, first off, excellent information. But the question is, can you explain to us how this is going to intersect with the statewide consumer directory that MyHin also holds, especially when you speak to the fact that this will allow us to potentially meet certain levels of compliance?
Yeah. So the interop station is the highest point of intersection between that. So the interop station is a Fire-based platform that combines the I'm sorry. I'm going to start that sentence over because I lost my train of thought. The interop station is the solution that's going to bring the health directory in, and that the interop station is designed to help meet compliance with things that are requiring Fire interfaces, including the consumer-facing one. And so the two come together there. What we've been focusing on in 2021 on the consumer space, we've been focusing on consent right now. And we've been relaunching our e-consent service that largely only intersects with the health directory in that you can look up in our tool who the providers and organizations are to give consent to. Yeah, I hope that answered your question.
I think it answered part of it. I think what I'm really targeting here is that when a patient specifically puts forth a request to share information with a specific provider, a specific endpoint, so on and so forth, trying to understand how we can make that association utilizing the tools that MyHin is developing, rather than internalizing this and developing operational processes at every one of our health ministries and or health systems across the state that we then have to try and unravel.
Gotcha. Okay. So definitely the intent behind our move to AWS is to get away from some of the API limitations that we had before. And so I would strongly, strongly encourage everyone to think organizationally about using our API as a reference point that you could, it's going to have every organization name and the currently assigned OIDs to that organization and their provider relationships that we know about with those organizations. That information can be queried via API and incorporated into anything that you are building so that you can be talking about the same people that we're talking about, so that if you collect consent and then later submit it to us, we would know that you're talking about the same parties that we know exist. I don't know that this is the right forum to really dive into e-consent more deeply, but the design of the e-consent service specifically is to have the ability for sub ECMSs or electronic consent management services below MyHINs that can hold their own consent, and then MyHIN can reference that. That's definitely part of the model. And you having the data stored in a way that we know the same, you're blah, blah, blah. We're talking about the same parties between us. That would be highly valuable. And I saw Donovan's comment. Thank you very much for that. I will be following up with you after this call. Are there other questions? Oh yeah, I was going to find that slide. But other questions? Well, I'm having trouble finding the slide that I was going to show, and so I'm going to take a risk right now, and I'm going to show you our development environment of the new user interface. So you'll have to forgive me if something does go wrong, but I think it should be okay. So the idea behind the user interface you're seeing here is it is astronomically simpler than what we had before, and that is highly
I don't think
intentional.
you're sharing the screen. Sorry to
Oh.
interrupt.
There we go. Can you see it now?
Yep.
Okay. So astronomically simpler than any user interface we had before, and that is highly intentional. We were trying to, the original health directory, I think, was had so many directions that you could go. It was very open-ended, and no one really knew what to do. The idea here is there is just a button where you can go to view standard reports, and it'll just be a list of reports. Or you can search for a provider here, and this is the development environment. I don't know it's a provider that I can search for, but I know that in the dev environment, I can search for space. So one of the key things about our user interface here is that the time cost and processing cost for having a list of providers in your search is going to be greatly reduced. So if I click on one particular provider, find out this isn't who I was looking for, I can go to the next one and then go down to the next one. And the time cost of working down your list is greatly reduced. In the final version that's going to be in production around April, there's going to be an advanced search where you can enter more than just the basic search here. I mean, the basic search, you can search anything. I can search for MD, I can search their name, I can search their specialty, I can search a bunch of different things. But in the advanced search, you'll be able to define, I want the NPI to be this specific number. Whereas right now, I'm just putting it in anything that matches that is going to return. And as I said, this is a dev environment. Sorry for that. But the idea, again, is that this is a highly streamlined process. The idea being that you are looking for a provider that meets some criteria for whatever reason. And so the search is central to your use of the tool. And you can then just see more information about the provider from here. There will definitely be more details on the page than what you're seeing right here. There's obviously a lot of demographic information not displayed on the page at this time. The directory is already capturing that information, but the user interface is still being built out. It does look like we are reaching the end of our time, 11:50. And so I'll ask if there are any other questions, and if not, then we can go ahead and wrap up. All right, with that, I will thank everyone for joining today. I hope you learned something about the health directory. I hope you heard a little bit about MyHIN, the direction MyHIN's going, and if we can be of help, I'd like to be of help. Thanks.
And Mike, you got a question from Beth King, so we'll take that offline and follow up with her after the call.
Okay. Thanks, everyone.